As I've come to understand, no retro YouTube journey is complete without repairing at least one Sega Game Gear. Why is that, you ask? Honestly, I don't know. I didn't make the rules. But in the interest of compliance, I mean expanding our knowledge, let's have a look, shall we?
Attention consumers, certain portable gaming systems are being dressed up in order to distract the buyer from their ordinary one-color play. What could be next? Little flower print dresses? Black leather restraining devices? Fresh baked olive loaf? Don't be fooled. Get Sega Game Gear. Basic black on the outside. Hundreds of exciting full-color games radiating from the inside. And we promise no sleazy little get-ups that scream, "Hello, big boy. Get Game Gear." Sega!
The Sega Game Gear was first released in late 1990 for a retail price of around $150 US, or $345 adjusted for inflation. The handheld featured hardware based on Sega's 8-bit Master System home console from 5 years earlier. Utilizing the venerable Zilog Z80 CPU clocked at 3.5 MHz, the system sported 8 KB of RAM and 16K of video memory, as well as the popular Texas Instruments SN76489 sound chip that was capable of producing 3 square waves and 1 noise channel. The Game Gear competed directly against Nintendo's own portable, the Game Boy. What set it apart was a full-color 3.2-inch screen offering a resolution of 160 by 144 pixels with 32 on-screen colors from a palette of 4096, a notable improvement from the Master System.
Whoa. Color.
The Sega featured a backlit screen, which resulted in a short battery life of only 3 to 5 hours, compared to the Game Boy's 30. The Game Gear went on to sell over 10 million units worldwide, which sounds good until you consider Nintendo's 120 million Game Boy sales. Over 300 games were released for the Sega, which again was overshadowed by the Game Boy's library of over 1,000 titles. A number of official accessories and add-ons were sold for the Game Gear, including a larger external battery pack, TV tuner, and even an adapter that allowed the use of Master System cartridges. Alright, with that out of the way, what we've got here, and this should come as a surprise to nobody, is a Sega Game Gear. Now, I purchased this unit on eBay for $59, and it was billed as for parts untested, so there's a good chance that it's broken and doesn't work, but we'll get to that in a minute. For now, let's open it up and see what we've got. All right, to start off with, we've got a sandwich bag of games. We'll take a look at that in a minute. Next up, this appears to be the main body of the Game Gear, stored in this gear tote, I'm sorry. This looks to be very well loved. It's quite wrinkled, quite used. I don't know what that means for the Game Gear itself, but we'll find out in a moment. We've got ourselves what appears to be a link cable. Looks very close to USB actually, but not USB, but looks similar. We've got a power brick, excellent. We can power it off of the AC, nice. And then we also have a Game Gear battery pack. So this would clip to your belt and you could power it with well, it looks like rechargeable NiCad batteries. That's cool. I'm sure you were the popular kid in school if you were walking around with that clipped to your waist. Oh, another link cable. Okay, 2 of those. Nice. All right, let's take a quick look at the game titles that came in the bag. We've got a handful here. We've got Mortal Kombat, one of my favorite games from the era. Sonic 2, okay, that's a good one. Looks like we've got Castle of Illusion, Mickey Mouse, that's also a popular title. Columns, not quite Tetris, but Sega's answer to it, I suppose. Another Sonic game, what do we got here? Sonic, just Sonic. It looks like the first one, Sonic the Hedgehog, first one. Mortal Kombat 2, also a great game, one of my favorites in the Mortal Kombat series. Got Tailspin, I've never played this one. Remember the TV show, cartoon? And Batman Returns for Game Gear. Looks like we've got the Penguin and Catwoman on there, and Michael Keaton's Batman. Cool. So that's it for games. Not bad though, included in the price, so pretty good pickup, I think. All right, now let's take a look at the Game Gear itself. And there we go. Okay. Actually, that looks to be in really, really nice condition. There's some fingerprints and some smudges, maybe a few scratches on the plastic bezel here, but in general, take a look at that. It hardly looks like it's been used at all. There's no wear marks at all on the buttons or the plastic body here. That looks to be in really, really excellent condition. I'm surprised given how much wear was on the game tote bag that it came in, but this is a really nice looking unit. Oh, and we've got another game here, Sonic 2. Okay, we'll add that to the pile. Great selection of games. All right, let's take a look in the battery compartments. Nice. Doesn't look to be like there was any corrosion. It doesn't look like it was stored with batteries in there. So there's no gunk. That's awesome. This thing was well cared for and stored properly, it looks like. So great. Well, I'm pleasantly surprised at what great condition the exterior of this unit's in, but that doesn't mean it's going to work. So let me put some batteries in and let's find out whether we have video, we got audio, or we don't have any of the above. It's a really common problem with all Game Gears that the capacitors leak. So if it hasn't been serviced yet, then it will need to be. And that's true of any Game Gear of this vintage. They're all going to need to be recapped if they haven't been. All right, we've got batteries. Let's flip the switch. See what, well, actually, let's not flip the switch. Let's put a cartridge in. And then let's flip the switch. Ooh. Dead as a doornail. No signs of life whatsoever. Hold, please. All right, just to rule out that the cartridge slot is dirty, I'm going to give it a hit up with this electrical contact cleaner. See if that will help. I don't suppose that's going to make a difference here, but it certainly won't hurt. So let's just give it a blast. And I'll try a different cartridge as well, just in case. All right. Anything? Nothing at all. All right. We've got nothing. All right, let's take this thing apart then.
Game Gear.
To disassemble your Game Gear, there are 6 screws, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and there's also a security screw here. This is called a game bit screw, and it requires a special screwdriver that's got sort of this flower pattern on the head here. And you can buy these online. I'll put a link in the description, and they're also available on the Retrobits Amazon store. So let's get this thing opened up. These screws are very firmly in place, very tight in there. Takes a lot of force on this little screwdriver. All right, with all the screws removed, you can now open the cover. You should take it and flip it towards the cartridge side of the screen because there's going to be ribbon cables here. There we go. Yep. And then we can open it like that. We'll have to disconnect those cables before we can remove the top half from the bottom half. All right, so to fully separate the two halves, we need to disconnect this wiring harness there. We need to disconnect the speaker here. And then this one here. All right. Now that we've got it all apart, we can check out the three main PCBs that we're going to need to look at today. First, of course, is the main board, and it looks like it's got most of the logic consolidated into this one big integrated PLCC chip here. We have a number of capacitors that we're going to have to look at, and of course we have the fluorescent backlighting and the cartridge port here. On the other half, we've got the audio board, which has the volume control knob and a few surface mount electrolytics here. And then over here we have the power regulation board, which we suspect is a problem because it wouldn't power on at all. And it has a few through-hole radial capacitors that we're going to need to check out as well. All right, I had a quick look at the main board here, and what I found is that there seems to be signs of corrosion around the base of these electrolytic capacitors. Check out the discoloration around the legs where they mount to the PCB. So I'm guessing these capacitors have leaked and that we're going to need to replace them. So that's what we're going to do. So after almost 3 years on YouTube, I'll finally get to repair a Game Gear and earn my official retro badge. I'm pretty sure that's how it works. Now before we can order replacement caps, we need to identify the model of our board because there are different revisions of the Game Gear main board. So what we have here is the VA1 version 837-9024. So we'll use those identifiers to find the correct capacitors for this board, the power board, and the audio board. Armed with the correct board revision, I paid a visit to console5.com to order a recap kit. They stock parts for each of the different Game Gear versions and ship quickly. I'm in no way sponsored by them, but I've always appreciated their excellent customer service. They also have an ever-expanding wiki that shows capacitor values and diagrams for each of the many systems they sell kits for. It's really useful info, especially if, like me, you're working on something for the very first time. And through the magic of YouTube, a few days later, we have our capacitors. And we've got ourselves a business card from Console 5 that has useful information about identifying capacitors. We've got our capacitors themselves for all three of the boards on our VA1 Game Gear. And we've got an atomic fireball, which they always include. And, you know, who doesn't love a fireball? All right, I'm going to start with the main PCB, and I'll remove all of the capacitors that we're going to be replacing. For that, I've printed out the diagram and the capacitor values from the Console 5 wiki, which will help identify what we need to remove. Now, there are a number of ways to approach this, but these capacitors, while they look like they're surface mount, and in fact they are mounted on the surface, they are standard radial lead capacitors, and despite their little plastic boxes that they're in, they are standard electrolytics, and if we remove the little plastic casing, you'll see that. So we could try and desolder each of the legs, we could use hot air to remove them, and in fact we may still, but I think the easiest thing to start with is just snipping the legs off of them and then desoldering the remainder of those legs. That will give us easy access to clean up all of the gunk that's left behind without making too much of a mess. All right, well, here goes nothing. We're just going to have to try and see, but I'm going to cut as close to the capacitor as I can. I don't want to put any undue stress on the body of on the PCB. I don't want to lift any pads. But if I cut those legs off the capacitor there, they're glued to the board as well, so we'll just need to gently rock them off the board. There we go. So the legs remain behind. The capacitor itself has come off. We can see the leaky juice and the glue that's been left behind. So it's damaged a little bit of the PCB there. Maybe that's just glue residue. No, it's wet, it's leaky. Yeah, that's totally leaky capacitor gunk there, so gross. Let me show you what I mean though. Inside this plastic case, there's just a regular old capacitor. If I remove the case, there, you can see it's just a regular capacitor inside there, just inside the plastic case. Now C68 here is a little bit of a challenge since it's so close to this coil, this transformer. Let me see if I can get in there at this sharp angle and just snip think that worked. Oh, not quite. There we go. So there we go, 12 leaky capacitors with gross corrosion all around their terminals, and then some amount of corrosion damage to the board. It's hard to tell right now how much of that is glue and how much of that is actual corrosion to the PCB. So this is going to be kind of just a first quick pass to remove some of the gunk, and then I'll desolder all of the legs. And once I've desoldered all of the legs, I'll try to clean the pads as best as I can. All right, I've done the initial cleanup, and what I'm thinking is that this is little pads of glue. This isn't corrosion, actually, so I think we've dodged a bullet here. I don't think these have leaked out as much or done any damage. So I'm going to try and remove all of the legs from the capacitors now just by heating the pads and removing what's left. Seems like it's easier in a lot of cases here just to use the soldering iron tip to remove the remainder of the leg instead of trying to use the tweezers. That way I'm not introducing an additional heat sink. All right, and here we go. All the legs have been removed. Now we need to clean up the solder pads, and there's a couple ways to do that. One, we could use some solder wick and just clean them up that way. I'm going to use my desoldering gun and just remove all of the excess and see what that leaves us with. Now some of these are particularly gunky and they won't clean up real well with just the desoldering gun, so I'm going to apply some flux, and I'm going to take my desoldering braid and I'm just going to go over them again. Okay, yeah, I think that's pretty good. I'm going to use my PA and a cotton bud, and I'm just going to try and clean up what's left. All right, time for the new capacitors. And unlike the originals, they're not in a square package. They're just your traditional through-hole capacitors that we're going to have to solder onto the board like this. So what I'm going to try and do is give them a little bend to their legs. So I'm going to start by giving it a little bend here, and then a little bend like that. And then that might be too much. That might be too much. Let me try and make that a little bit less of an extreme length here. All right, there we go. I've tightened it up a little bit. That's actually quite awkward, but it should work if we drop it into place there and hold it down while I solder the pads. So let's do that. All right, one down, 12 to go. All right, and there we go. All 12 capacitors have been removed, cleaned, and replaced. It's not my finest work ever. It is a little fiddly installing through-hole capacitors on surface mount pads, but I got a little bit better at forming the legs as time went on, so it did go pretty smoothly. Hopefully that will work. And now we have to move on to the power and audio boards. In order to remove these two boards, we're going to have to take out this bracket that's held in by these 4 screws. There's a couple mounting screws that secure the boards to the chassis, and then we've got this little piece of insulating plastic that covers up the battery terminals there. So those will all have to come out. All right, so on cursory examination, we've got the power board here, and it's got these 3 regular through-hole electrolytics, and I don't see any signs of bulging, I don't see any signs of leakage, and I don't see any damage to the board itself, which is great news. So what I'll do is I'll desolder these caps, run them through the tester, and just see what condition they're in before replacing them anyway. And then over here on the audio board, we've got these surface mount caps here, and there is indication of a little corrosion here on the solder joints. So they may have just started to leak, but I don't see any real damage to the board. So it looks like we're in pretty good shape just to desolder these, replace them, and move on. So yeah, I don't see any signs of leaking here underneath where the caps were, so I think we're in good shape. Let me just pull out the tester and we'll see what we've got. All right, so I've got my tester here, and I've already tested the first 2 small caps, and they both tested out fine. Now I've got this big cap here. It is an 820 microfarad capacitor, so let's see how this one tests out. And we've got 747 microfarads at 0.12 ohms of ESR. That seems like it's probably okay. I can't see that that would cause this whole thing not to power up at all. So it looks like the 3 capacitors on the power supply board are actually in relatively good condition. So I don't think these were the ones that were causing the system not to boot up. Now when it comes to these surface mount capacitors, we have a couple options. Some people prefer to trim them off with clippers and then remove the legs with a traditional soldering iron. That is one way to tackle the problem, but it can place stress on the pads and you do risk lifting a pad doing that. Another option is 2 soldering irons at the same time, or heated tweezers that are specially made to remove surface mount parts. But what I'm going to use is hot air. So the first thing I need to do is protect all the parts that I don't want to desolder with a little bit of Kapton tape. So let me do that now. Yeah, I reckon that's probably good enough. And there we go. That was surprisingly easy. And if you take a look here, you can see that there's a lot of cap juice, and that smelled really, really bad when I was removing them. So we definitely have problems here on the audio board. And as always, we're going to use a little IPA and try and remove as much of that gross as we can. Yuck. All right, good. And as before, I'll use the desoldering gun to remove the remainder of the solder on the pads. Yeah, that looks pretty nice. I don't see any problems there. So I think we're good to go. And as before, we have several options on how we want to install the caps. Some people choose to use flux and flow solder onto them with the capacitor already in place. What I'm going to do is solder one pad and then sneak the capacitor onto the pad with the solder already there. So let's start with C1. And of course, you could also use hot air to reinstall this. There we go. Not great, but not bad. All right, I went through everything off camera one more time because it's really difficult to work on these things when your arms are stretched out and your head is trying not to block the camera. It looks like they're all in there. They're all pretty good. It's really kind of tight in some of these spots, but I think I got it. So let's put it all back together and see what happens. All right, I've reassembled everything. I've got the unit back together. I've got batteries in there. So let's put a game in and see what we've got. Fingers crossed. Okay, that's good. We've got a power LED. I don't think we saw that before. The backlight's on. Nothing else is happening. Let me give the cartridge a wiggle. Sometimes it's just the cartridge slot. Oh, okay. Now we've got something on the screen. We've got the Sega logo. There we go. We've got a game. So it's running. I don't hear anything. Twiddle the volume knob, nothing. Is there any music that's supposed to be playing here? Let's start a game and see what happens. Okay, game's working, no sound at all. So either I screwed something up with the capacitor replacement on the soundboard, or there was some damage that I didn't see. So I'm going to have to take this apart and inspect the soundboard a little more closely. But good progress so far. We've got a running game. We're 75% the way there, or something. All right, on further inspection, I found two problems. The first was this cap here, the one that I had a hard time getting the soldering iron to, wasn't connected properly. And I found that by using my capacitor tester, testing the capacitor in line, and it was unable to test this one cap. All the other ones tested fine in circuit. This one did not. So I removed it and resoldered this one cap, and now it does test fine in circuit. The second problem I found was I had bent one of these tiny little pins here on the wiring harness, and when I reconnected this connector here, the pin got bent right out of the way and wasn't connected at all. So I've repaired both problems. Let's put this back together and then test again. All right, so I've got it all back together. And if there's a lesson here, it's don't put all the screws in until you fully tested it. Fortunately, I did test it before I put it back together. Otherwise, I'd be taking it all back apart again. But we've got it together, so let's fire it up and see if it works now. Hey, there we go. Just had to turn the volume up, but it's working. We've got sound. And one other thing is that there's a brightness knob on the side here, so if you're trying out the Game Gear for the first time and you see no image at all, it simply could be that the brightness is turned all the way down. And this backlit LCD, of course, is the reason the battery life on this system is so poor. But it's nice to have that option. It actually goes up pretty bright. Very cool, though. We have a working system, so let's try out a few of the games. I've got to admit that I've never played one of these before today. Some friends in middle school had Game Boys, but I never knew anyone with a Game Gear. I did have a Master System for a while, so I kinda knew what to expect from the games though. This is the very first generation of color LCD handhelds, and you can tell. The screen is notorious for being washed out and difficult to see, especially with the kind of fast motion in Sonic here. You kinda have to use your imagination a bit. This is what the game actually looks like when running on the Mr. Core. The screen also suffers from viewing angle issues, but you have to expect that from LCDs of this era. Modern replacements are available, but they cost more than I paid for this whole lot. I plan to leave it original for the time being. In 2023, we're spoiled by things like the Switch and Steam Deck, but we mustn't forget portable gaming's humble beginnings. Without a doubt, I would have enjoyed the heck out of this thing when I was 14 years old.
Some people are content to be entertained by simple one-color electronics. Somehow these people have just never heard of Game Gear, the multicolor portable from Sega with tons of new titles. Yeah, some people are like that, but then some people like to eat pickled pork lips.
I finally repaired a Sega Game Gear, and that means this channel is now official, right? Would I recommend tackling this job yourself? Well, that depends on your equipment, patience, and ability to work in small spaces. Honestly, it wasn't my favorite system to work on, but if I can do it, anyone can. I hope you enjoyed this bit. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Retro Bits.